Hello, welcome back. It's Diva Divine. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from around the world, wherever you're from. Hello, welcome to my channel, guys. Well, we will be continuing to read the transcripts of day 8 of the trial of R. Kelly. And it will begin with the cross examination of Mr. Canick, who is the defense lawyer for R. Kelly, and the victim witness, one of the Jane Does, and her nickname is Addie. Before we get into this, guys, hello. This is a pre-recorded live, so hello everyone. Sorry, I want to say a massive hello to everyone. I love you guys. Thank you for being here. And remember that we are still collecting for the transcript fund. We are up to $40. So we need to get back up there, guys, so we can at least get 2 more transcripts. And remember, it's $1.20 per page. And they're anywhere from 250 pages to 300 pages long. So if you can, please continue to donate. My Cash App and Atmos Love Zone's Cash App is scrolling on the bottom of the screen. You can donate to those Cash Apps if you have Cash App. If you don't have a Cash App, you can Zelle me. And my Zelle information is in the About section to my channel. Go to the About section, it'll tell you all my information there. Okay? And when you do the donations, I will give you a copy of the transcript. But you have to email me. And my email is diva.divine. No, I'm sorry. My email is diva.josh.32332@gmail.com. All right. When you email me your YouTube name in the subject, saying that you're requesting for the transcripts and who you paid, whether it was me or whether it was Atmos. Okay. And I will send you a copy as soon as they get here. All right. Let's see who else. Hello everyone once again. Hello. Everybody just jumping in the chat. If I get to jump in the chat with you guys, if I'm not busy, I will be here with you guys in the chat. I will join you. As I said, this is a pre-recorded live. Okay. So now that we got all that out of the way, we're going to listen first to a couple of things that are going on with the trial. And I also threw in a little bonus clip about Aaliyah. Okay? So please enjoy the show. And don't forget to please hit that like button, share the video. If you're not subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscription button and the bell next to it. Make sure you put it on all so you can get all my videos, everything I upload. And if you are not a member of the Badass Warriors of Divine Light and you would like to join, please make sure you hit the join button on the channel there. It's $1.99 a month. And you guys get to get some perks. Also join my book club, which I will be starting shortly. And in the membership, you guys get a little perks as far as little things that I find here and there, and things that I want to share with you guys in private, and the whole world doesn't have to know, and we can have discussions about it as well. I'm trying to figure out how to do the video. I will eventually. And like I said, we'll do private book clubs and things of that nature. And as time goes on, I'll think of other things. So in the meantime, guys, please don't forget to hit that like button. Thank you.
Today marks day 14 in R. Kelly's racketeering and sex trafficking trial. The prosecution is expected to rest its case as early as Monday, clearing the way for R. Kelly's defense team to try and do some damage control. But today, outside of the federal courtroom in Brooklyn, Kelly had another staunch supporter. BNC's Dre Clark got an exclusive interview with R. Kelly's brother.
R. Kelly hasn't received a lot of support here at his federal trial in New York. There are limited people allowed inside to watch the trial, and outside it's been relatively quiet. But this week, among those who are here to support him is his younger brother, Kerry. They haven't always seen eye to eye, but now things have changed.
I've been hearing a lot of different things, and I want to come see for myself.
Kerry Kelly, singer R. Kelly's younger brother, is hard to miss outside federal court in Brooklyn. The t-shirt he's wearing and the banner he's carrying makes it clear he's here in full support of his brother. R. Kelly is on trial for sex trafficking and racketeering charges. If he's convicted, he could receive 10 years to life in prison. Prosecutors maintain R. Kelly is a sexual deviant who for decades sexually abused underage girls using money and mind manipulation. Throughout his trial, so far, multiple accusers, some of them underage when they started having sex with R. Kelly, testified he was controlling and abusive, slapping, spanking, and humiliating them when he was angry. And they say he had a team of people who helped him carry out his alleged crimes.
I got a chance to see the lies that these people told in the court of law under oath. It changed the whole game, for me.
It's an about-face for Kerry. 2 years ago, Kerry, in multiple interviews, said his brother had a problem, and he noticed troubling behavior between his brother and what looked like underage girls. He was even quoted as saying he felt bad he did not speak up earlier after allegations against his brother started surfacing. But now Kerry says he regrets saying anything negative about his brother, and the past doesn't matter, because now he's standing by his brother because very few others will. Simply put, he says his brother's accusers are liars.
They lying. They are lying on him in the court of law. Everybody see it. That's there. That's part of it. You see it.
So far, more than 30 people, including accusers, have testified either directly against R. Kelly or provided testimony supporting the prosecution's claim that R. Kelly sexually abused underage girls. Kelly's defense team has tried discrediting his accusers, pointing out they lied to Kelly about their age. They took money from him, enjoyed lavish gifts and trips, and then became disgruntled when Kelly ended the relationship. The jury will ultimately decide how the case concludes. Meanwhile, Kerry Kelly can't see his brother in person because of COVID restrictions. It means he has to watch the trial on a monitor in a separate courtroom. But he says his brother knows he has support. In New York, I'm Dre Clark for Making the Case.
Defending Kelly is a tall order after weeks of graphic and corroborating accounts of his alleged sexual and emotional abuse. Back with me with his nightly breakdowns is, of course, a veteran prosecutor and BNC's legal contributor, Paul Henderson. All right, Paul, your reaction to this about face from R. Kelly's brother. He previously said Kelly had a problem, but now says he believes all of these accusers are lying.
Well, I'm sympathetic to family members for folks that are in the situation where they're being prosecuted, but that doesn't really change my perspective or analysis of the testimony, which is evidence that's coming in on this case. I certainly understand that his brother does not want him prosecuted. What I think is interesting is his allegations or his claims about the folks that are testifying lying about what they're saying. And I think that's an opportunity for us to kind of unpack some of the folks that are still supportive and are being supportive about R. Kelly and look at it against the testimony that's coming in against R. Kelly. I presume that your Twitter and Instagram, like mine, is flooded with folks that are supportive of R. Kelly against the evidence that's coming in. And I think this is a great opportunity for us to really look at the information that we're learning from this testimony, which is evidence that we're seeing in the courtroom. So in addition to the testimony that came in today, we're hearing from a lot of folks that are challenging the testimony that are coming in from the myriad of folks. Remember, it's over a dozen men and women. The allegation is that they are just fans, and we can just call them groupie or engaged in groupie behavior, that they lied about their age, that they accepted money, that they took trips, that they were consensually engaged in activities with R. Kelly. And let's just be clear, at this point, it could not be more obvious to all of us that he was a BOF, big old freak, and just a celebrity. But the real issue is the line that gets crossed about criminal behavior. So whatever judgment you have about groupie behavior or fan behavior or consensual behavior, the real focus should be on criminal behavior by R. Kelly. The racketeering allegations of sexual exploitation, of kidnapping, of transportation of a minor, of statutory rape. And that's a real thing that we have to focus on and talk about. Over all of these people are talking about issues. And remember, rape requires force or fear to be proven. We're talking about statutory rape, and the distinction between rape and statutory rape is consent. With statutory rape, there is consent. The law says when you are under a certain age, you cannot give consent. It's as if you allow someone to shoot you and say, no, it's okay. It's still illegal. That's what statutory rape is. So if you have consensual sex with someone underage, that is illegal. That's the point. And so all of the lies, all of the accepting money, all of the trips, all of the delayed testimony, none of that matters if there was consensual sexual interactions with people that underage. That is what's really significant and what stands out to me when I'm listening to people that are critical of the prosecution and don't want R. Kelly prosecuted. I understand he's a musical genius and a celebrity, but the evidence and the testimony that's coming in is making him look guilty to me. I'm curious to hear and see what the rest of the testimony and the defense will be in the case.
All right, now to what happened in court today, Paul. The jury heard from an expert witness, a doctor from NYU, who talked about sexually transmitted diseases, specifically herpes. Several of the accusers say R. Kelly gave it to him, but why is hearing from this doctor so significant, and why does she describe the STD so objectively?
Yeah, well, so for two reasons. One, specifically, so let's talk about why the doctor wasn't talking about R. Kelly and having his medical records, right? There's still HIPAA restrictions in terms of his medical background, in terms of what can be admitted in a court and talked about publicly. So the doctor was very clearly outlining and explaining how herpes works and what happens with herpes and what the symptoms and all that stuff are, because that speaks to the consensual nature of the sexual interaction that over a dozen people have talked about with R. Kelly, in articulating and making it probably more likely than not for this jury to hear and see. This is not the kind of things that people would have consented to, especially if we're listening to and believing the testimony. We're talking about a lot of people where this was their first sexual experience was with R. Kelly, and they came away from that sexual experience with R. Kelly for the first time and with no one else with this disease, as an indication that R. Kelly was guilty of giving them this herpes, but more importantly, that he was the one that had a sexual experience with them that transmitted herpes. That's why they had to explain it in the way that they explained it. And it also speaks to the consent, even if you thought that maybe these folks are all groupies and are all liars, were they consenting to this exposure from herpes as well? That's why the prosecution wants to put this information out there and explain how herpes works so the jury can hear and understand and chip away at the arguments the defense is likely to argue later on about consent for the parties involved with R. Kelly.
All right, the last person we heard from today was one of Kelly's former employees who booked plane tickets for some of the women who traveled with Kelly. Could this witness and others like her face criminal liability for booking travel for underage minors in order to engage in illegal sexual activity?
Well, not in this case, and presumably they've gotten waivers, they've been indemnified or cleared of liability in order for their testimony for this federal trial. But that's only in the federal trial jurisdiction. The real danger is all of these people that helped, that booked tickets, that managed the girls, right? And they were locked in separate rooms, if we're believing the testimony, for long periods of time, and they were always rotating in and out. The issue is if they knew or should have known, exposes them to some liability. If they knew who was in those locked rooms, if they knew that young girls were being exposed sexually, did any of them see any of the taped sex play that all of the witnesses and all of the victims are saying took place, then they did know or should have known. And that liability may be exposed in some of the subsequent cases that are still pending against R. Kelly at the state level for sexual assault and sex with minor cases. And there's still at least 2 of those cases pending. And then the big looming threat for all of them are the civil charges that could come out of this testimony against everyone that's involved with R. Kelly. And that's the real risk here. But obviously the testimony is coming in the way that it's coming in, and it's corroborative with the stories that we're hearing from the victims talking about they weren't of age. They couldn't afford their tickets. Someone was coordinating them to and from airports, buying them tickets, sending them to vacations, putting them in these locked rooms and feeding them. And those people are liable, but that speaks to the racketeering charges that are targeted with R. Kelly specifically.
Paul, at some point next week, we expect to see the defense begin its case in chief. We've seen a preview of their strategy on cross-examination, but do you think the defense will put up any witnesses? We've seen how many witnesses the state put up, right? I mean, will the defense put on many, if any at all?
I think they have to put on some just to put on a credible defense. If it were me, I would put on entertainment experts or psychologists to talk about groupies, how much they're willing to do to show that these were really willing participants. But as I explained earlier, their willingness is a red herring. That means it's a distraction to the jury. The real ultimate issue that prosecutors are going to try and get the audience and the jury to focus on is the criminal behavior of R. Kelly, and not be distracted by folks having memories where they don't remember all of the things that happened decades ago, where they accepted money, that they took trips, that they wanted to get close to R. Kelly or meet him or want something from him or took something from him. The real issue is R. Kelly's behavior. But if I were a part of the defense team, that's really the only direction that they can go in order to try and make a credible defense or argument.
Well, I'm curious about what an entertainment expert is, but we're definitely going to be looking forward to seeing what they put up next week. All right, veteran prosecutor and legal contributor, Paula Henderson, thank you so much.
With a BNC exclusive, singer R. Kelly's federal sex trafficking and racketeering charges case is now in its 2nd week. And for the first time since the trial started, R. Kelly's brother is speaking out, and he tells us that what's happening to his brother is wrong. Standing by right now to tell us all about this is our Dre Clark. Dre?
Laverne, good afternoon. Kerry Kelly is singer R. Kelly's younger brother. He's been here this week along with other family members listening to testimony here at federal court. Kerry says that he does not believe any of the accusers who have testified so far. He thinks they're lying. And here's more of the conversation we had with Kerry Kelly a short time ago.
What made you decide to come out here?
Well, I decided to come out because I've been hearing a lot of different things, and I want to come see for myself. So that's why I took the trip here. And I'm glad that I did come. At the end of the day, that's my brother. I'm here to support him, and I love him. That's my brother. And I got a chance to see the lies that these people told in the court of law under oath. It changed the whole game, for me, to be able to see that with my own eyes, not hearsay, but see-say, and this difference.
And what do you think is going to be the outcome with this case?
Well, I think they should actually just throw it out. He should be acquitted of drop the charges because, I mean, they lying. They are lying on him in the court of law. Everybody see it. That's there. That's part of it. You see it. That's it.
Is there anything else that I didn't ask you that you want to add as a brother, seeing your brother go through this, and how does it make you feel?
It hurts. It hurts my heart. You know, it really do. I feel for him. You know, because actually I'm being attacked at a lower level of this, so I could just only imagine his level is like 100,000 times mine. I don't have the money or the fame that he has, and I'm being attacked by women, kids, mothers, things of that nature.
Why are you being attacked?
Well, I'm not going to go into that right now, but I'm saying I understand that I got a chance to put his shoes on, and that's what a lot of people don't do. They don't put your shoes on to see if they can fit you. They just say this and say that, you know, make their comments, but they don't have your shoes on. People have to actually put your shoes on. And I believe that God allowed me to be able to put my brother's shoes on.
And we should mention that female voice you hear asking the questions is Olivia. She's our field producer, and she also spoke with Carrie Kelly a short time ago. Now, some people will hear those remarks, and they may find Carrie's remarks a bit confusing and surprising, because just 2 years ago, he had a much different perspective on his brother's situation. In an interview with CBS 2 in Chicago, Carrie Kelly was asked directly if he believes his brother is a pedophile. And I'm going to read the quote. He said, I can't say that for sure. I just know that he has a problem with control. I love my brother, but he does have a problem. And if anybody out there loves him, they should want to get him help. In that same interview, Carrie said this. He noticed troubling behavior decades ago when his brother would ask him to, quote, get girls for him at concerts. And he goes on to say, to me, they looked underage. And then finally, in that same interview, Carrie Kelly says, to see all of these other women come forth and hear the allegations and different things, I feel bad that I did not speak earlier than what I did. So you can understand how hearing Carrie Kelly today, his remarks is contrary to what he said 2 years ago. Carrie Kelly also appeared in that documentary, Surviving R. Kelly, and he said some rather negative things against his brother. In fact, it split the family after that documentary aired. But now he is here at federal court in Brooklyn, along with other family members. And as you heard a moment ago, in his own words, he believes that the accusers who have testified so far are lying on his brother. Meanwhile, R. Kelly has pleaded not guilty to sex trafficking and racketeering charges. However, if he is convicted, he faces 10 years to life in prison. Laverne?
Yeah, the whole thing absolutely troubling. Thank you so much, Audrey.
Including Aaliyah, when she was only 14 and 15 years old. When she was only 14, including relationships with young teens, including Aaliyah, relationships with young teens, including Aaliyah, when she was only 14 and 15 years old. Kelly responded to ABC through his lawyer.
Does he deny ever having a sexual relationship with someone who was under the age of consent?
Yes, he absolutely does.
Was he married to Aaliyah when she was 15?
He was married to her when she was 15. Elvis was married to Priscilla.
But so then 15 is not of the age of legal consent, right? I mean,
right, except that my understanding is that she did not claim to be 15. And in order to get married, she had to lie about her age.
And he is saying that he had no idea.
No idea.
But in this video on YouTube, Kelly appears to know exactly how old Aaliyah is.
Right now, I'm producing a very talented young lady. She's 14, Aaliyah.
So how did he get away with it and continue to be a star? A source told me to go to the Oakland County Probate Court to review Aaliyah's file.
I went and started doing research, and I started finding things.
In the 90s, a judge appointed now retired attorney George Cushingberry to represent Aaliyah. His job was to make sure no one took advantage of her financially. When he heard she got married in Chicago, he went there.
Somebody lied and said that this baby was older than she was and that she should get married.
I obtained copies of some of the documents he submitted to probate court. He says when he turned them in, he expected action on behalf of Aaliyah. Instead, he says her family was outraged at him.
You told the judge what? How did you find out?
He was told to focus on her tax returns, making sure they're correct. Still, he submitted some of the evidence that's in the file, but as of today, that report is not in the file. When I go and look in the court file, it looks like there's documents missing.
Oh, probably. Number one would be the report, because he didn't want a written report that way.
I called the judge who was on the case more than 20 years ago, and he reviewed the file for me. I asked him why not all the documents on the case register were there. He said, well, it's a public file and everyone has access to it. There's no telling what happened. Cushingberry says when he saw the Surviving R. Kelly special, he could not help but wonder if other women could have been protected.
I would have liked to have had more outrage from the family itself.
I would have liked that too, sir.
On Twitter has called the allegations of the inappropriate relationship between Aaliyah and R. Kelly lies that harm her legacy.
Her talent speaks for itself, and that she was clearly a victim. If it turns out to be true, R. Kelly's legacy is severely damaged by these allegations.
Kim Russell, 7 Action News.
The family was definitely trying to keep their secrets a secret. As for Aaliyah's, her mom's statement, you can't call out lies with lies. Everyone know they were married and got an annulment. Just come out with the truth.
Lord, it's long over.
Lord, just come out with the truth. Aaliyah's mother needs to take that stand. She needs to be subpoenaed. Something got to happen. That poor baby girl, she ain't getting no justice at all. Well, let's continue here. I'm going to continue to read where our brother Atmos left off. He left off at 1763. As I said, this is the cross-examination of the witness by Mr. Canick, who is the defense lawyer for R. Kelly. And the witness, we're going to start with the witness answering the question. And her name is Addie, which is a nickname. That's not her real name. She says, no, I don't recall. Mr. Canick says, and your lawyer was with you, am I correct? She says, no. He said, when was the time you met with them before yesterday? Probably another time. Sometime last week, I believe. I don't recall. Mr. Canick asked, sometime last week? She said, yes. Mr. Canick said, okay. And how long was that meeting? She said, around the same time. Mr. Canick said, what is the same time? Addie says, I don't know. Like maybe an hour? He's like, an hour? She says, yeah. He said, and all of these people were there? Am I correct? When I say these people at this table? She said, not all. He said, not all of them? She said, yeah. He said, the majority? She said, I don't understand the question. He said, you don't understand what majority means? The judge says, Mr. Canick, please don't do that. Miss Melendez says, objection. The judge says, he wants to know, do you recall which of those people at the government table, do you remember which ones were at the meeting? This is the last week meeting? Mr. Canick said, yes. The judge said, okay. The meeting last week, And Addie says, probably 2 at the table. 3? And he says, Mr. Caddick says, and before last week, before the meeting that we're discussing that occurred last week, when had you met with them before that? She said, probably the first time when I let them know about the situation. Mr. Caddick said, in that sense, it's your testimony that you met with them about 3 times? She said, I would say that's a good number, yes. Mr. Caddick said, and according to you, you met with them about an hour yesterday and an hour at the time previous to that. So the 2 hours, what about the first time you met them? How long was that? She said, first time, I believe like an hour as well. Mr. Caddick says, okay. And before coming in and giving testimony, had you ever spoken with them over the telephone? She said, no. He said, so basically all your meetings with them have been face to face? She said, yes. Mr. Caddick said, and in their preparation of you to come and give testimony, did they discuss your prior statements that you had given? Addie says, excuse me? Mr. Caddick said, did they discuss with you your statements that you had given them on prior occasions? She says, oh, basically just prepping me to understand how the system works, to understand testimony. Mr. Caddick said, well, they did more than that. They went over the questions that they were going to ask you. Am I correct? Addie says, there was no set questions. Mr. Caddick said, there were they didn't discuss with you yesterday what they asked you here today? She says, not in a set format, no. He said, I'm not asking about the format. I'm asking you. Did they discuss with you yesterday the questions, the subject matter that they asked you here before? She said, they discussed the topic and subject matter. And Mr. Caddick says, and did they discuss with you the questions that you would likely be asked on cross-examination? She said, they can. There's no way to know what the questioning is. And then Mr. Caddick says, they didn't tell you? Well, you may be asked this question by the other lawyer. She said, no. Mr. Caddick said, they didn't tell you that the other lawyer is going to likely ask questions of you? She said, I don't think they know what you're going to ask. Mr. Caddick says, that's not my question. She said, no. He said, my question is, they didn't tell you what the other lawyer? She said, no. Mr. Caddick said, would likely? She said, no. And Mr. Caddick said, let me finish, please. They didn't tell you that the other lawyer is likely to ask you a question? She said, of course, yes, you're likely to ask questions. Mr. Caddick said, and did they go over what questions they anticipate the lawyer to ask? She said, they let me know what cross-examination was about. Mr. Caddick said, my question is, did they go over with you the questions that they anticipate you being asked? She said, yes. He said, so they did. Nothing further, Your Honor. The judge says, any redirect examination? Miss Melendez says, yes, Your Honor. Now we're going to redirect examination by Miss Cruz Melendez. So now Miss Cruz Melendez will be cross-examining Addie. So Ms. Melendez asks Addie, Addie, have you ever spoken publicly about what happened to you in September of 1994? Addie says, no. Mr. Koenig says, beyond the scope, Your Honor. The judge says, sorry, I did not hear. Mr. Koenig said, beyond the scope. The judge said, overruled. Ms. Melendez continues her questioning and asks, now, defense counsel asked you a question about the individuals who approached you and your friend about getting an autograph from the defendant. Do you recall those questions? Addie says, I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Ms. Melendez says, do you recall defense counsel asking you questions about the two men who approached you to see if you wanted an autograph from the defendant? She said, yes. Ms. Melendez says, what made you think that those two men worked for the defendant? She said, because they came straight to us, asked us if we would like to go to the dressing room to get autographs from R. Kelly, and escorted us straight to him. Ms. Melendez says, now, defense counsel also asked you about statements in a report saying that you once stated that the concert happened in 1992. Had you ever seen the report that defense counsel showed you? She said no. Okay, Government Exhibit 201. Did you provide this to the government? She said yes. Is this the pamphlet that you had on the date that the defendant pinned your arms and had sex with you? She said yes. Ms. Melendez says, is there any doubt in your mind that this is the pamphlet from that concert? She said no. Ms. Melendez says, if I could show the witness and the jury and the public Government Exhibit 201, is there any doubt in your mind that this is the all-access ticket that you used to get into that concert? Addie says, no doubt in my mind. Ms. Melendez says, and when is the year listed there? She says, 1994. And when is the date? And what is the date? She said September 2nd. Ms. Melendez says, nothing further, Your Honor. The judge says, any recross? Mr. Koenig said, just briefly. Now, Mr. Koenig is going to recross his examination of the witness, Addie. And Mr. Koenig asks, the pamphlet? She said, yes. Mr. Koenig said, the pamphlet that you just testified about. Did you take that pamphlet with you when you had your interview, your initial interview with the government? She said, yes, I did. Yes. Mr. Koenig said, and did you give it to the government on the date that you had your initial interview? She said, yes. Mr. Koenig asked, now, you were born in November of 1976. Am I correct? She said, correct. He says, so basically, on the date of this concert, according to you, the concert you supposedly attended, you were 17 and 10 months? Addie says, I believe so. Yes, my birthday is in November. And Mr. Canick says, and do you recall the announcement that you had to be 18 to go for the autograph? Am I correct? She said, yes. And Mr. Canick said, nothing further. The judge says, anything else? Miss Melendez says, no, Your Honor. The judge says, all right, thank you so much. You can step down. Now the witness is excused. And the judge says, are you ready to call your next witness? And then Ms. Shihata says, yes, Your Honor. The government calls Derek Stevens. And the judge says, Derek, say the last name again. Ms. Shihata says, Stevens. The judge said, Stevens. And there's a pause. And I'm going to pause myself and take something to drink. Wow. So now we're going to another witness by the name of Mr. Derek Stevens. And this person is being called by the government. Okay. Now, Ms. Shihata says, Judge, I understand the witness is just using the bathroom. And the judge says, and now everybody knows. She's like, we didn't need to say all of that. That was just a little bit too much information. Now the witness enters the courtroom. And Derek Stevens is called by the government, having been first duly sworn and was examined and testified as follow. Now the clerk says, please state your name for the record. Have a seat. The court, which is the judge, says, okay, just a couple of things before we begin. Our court reporter takes down everything that you say. So try not to speak too quickly and just let whichever lawyer is asking you questions finish speaking before you start speaking. It just makes it hard when we talk over one another. Then she says, if there is a question that you need to have repeated or that you do not understand, let me know and I will have the lawyer rephrase it. And just do your best to answer all of the questions that you are being asked, okay? Mr. Derek Stevens says, thank you. Judge says, is that on the microphone? It sounds like it. Okay, go ahead. And then Ms. Shihata says, thank you, Your Honor. Now, we're going to direct examination by Ms. Shihata, which is the prosecutor for the government. So now she says, good morning, Mr. Stevens. He says, good morning. She says, your first name is Derek, correct? He says, correct. She said, do you go by any nicknames? He says, Devin Stevens. Oh, so this is the guy, Devin. Oh, okay. Question. And did you receive a subpoena to testify here today? He says, yes. She said, do you want to be here today? He said, no, ma'am. She said, how old are you? He said, 51. She said, are you currently employed? He said, yes. She said, what do you do? He said, music management and artist development. Ms. Shihata said, and do you own your own business? He says, yes. She said, how long have you worked in music and artist development? He said, 30 years. She said, where are you based? He said, Atlanta. Are you familiar with an individual known as R. Kelly? Yes, ma'am. She says, and have you met him personally? Mr. Stevens says, yes. Ms. Shihata said, have you worked professionally with him? He said, yes. She said, what is his real name? He said, Robert Sylvester Kelly. She said, do you see Robert Kelly in the courtroom here today? He said, yes. She said, can you point him out and identify him by an item of clothing he's wearing? He said, blue suit, tie. The judge says, indicating the defendant. And then Mr. Stevens says, yes. Ms. Shihata says, around when did you first meet the defendant? He says, first met the defendant in 2013, between, 2013. And how did you first meet him? I was introduced to Mr. Kelly through a lady by the name of Cheryl Mack. And I'm showing you what's been marked for identification as Government Exhibit 38. Do you recognize this person? He said, yes, I do. She said, who is that? He said, Cheryl Mack. Ms. Shihata says, I moved to admit Government Exhibit 38. Mr. Kanik said, no objection. The judge says, all right, in evidence. Ms. Shihata says, I'm being told it may have already been in evidence, so I apologize. May I publish it, please? The judge says, yes. Now, Ms. Shihata asks, and in 2013, what, if any, relationship did you have with Cheryl Mack? He said, she was my assistant. So she was working for you? He said, yes. And around when did she, Cheryl Mack, become your assistant? He said, I want to say in 2013 as well. And what were Cheryl Mack's responsibilities as your assistant? He said, to handle my day-to-day affairs, my itinerary. Ms. Shihata says, and when you say day-to-day affairs, what do you mean? He said, just day-to-day calendar in terms of setting up meetings and things of that nature. She said, and how was it that you ended up meeting the defendant through Cheryl Mack? He said, Cheryl introduced me to Mr. Kelly at a mutual producer, a friend's house. And whose house was that? He said, Little Ronnie. She said, was it your understanding that Cheryl Mack had known the defendant from before? He said, yes. She said, you indicated you testified you were introduced to the defendant at Little Ronnie's house. Is that right? He said, correct. She said, where was that? He said, in Atlanta. She said, and did you speak to the defendant at that house? He said, yes. She said, and what did you discuss with the defendant there? He said, we just talked about different business, talked about music, talked about the legacy of R. Kelly. And what do you mean by that? He said, just in terms of where he was at musically and where he was trying to go. And what, if anything, did the defendant say to you about that? Mr. Kanik said, objection. The judge said, overruled. Ms. Shihata says, go ahead, you can answer. Mr. Stevens said, just more like, in terms of just growing his business, that's mostly what we spoke about. And Ms. Shihata said, what, if anything, did you agree to do for the defendant after meeting him at Little Ronnie's house. He said, I agreed to bring different collaborations, features, and just business dealings and help with his career. She says, when you first met with the defendant, where was he based? He said, Chicago. She said, and did that change at some point? He said, yes. She said, how did it change? He said, moved to Atlanta? She said, who moved to Atlanta? He said, the defendant. And where did the defendant initially stay when he first moved to Atlanta? He says, I think he might have stayed at a hotel somewhere, like it might have been Homestead Suite or something. She asks, while you were working with the defendant, did he use your residence? He said, yes. I mean, he used my residence for recording and fitness training, and, during the course of the fitness training, playing basketball was part of the training, physical. At the time, what kind of residence did you have in Atlanta? Can you describe it for the jury, please? He said, the residence was an artist development residence. It had studios on both sides, the left and right, and 4 regulation NBA basketball courts in the house. She says, and did you also live in that house? He said, yes. And she says, after agreeing to work with the defendant, what types of things did you do with respect to the defendant? He said, in terms of the fitness part, could you repeat that again? She says, what type of work did you do for the defendant? He said, just business deals. I was able to work out a deal with Live Nation for touring. I also different collaborations with artists, features, also help consult in the process of his negotiations with RCA. You mentioned Live Nation. What is that? He said, a touring booking company. She says, you mentioned RCA. What is that? He said, a record label distribution company. She said, with respect to the deal you put together for Live Nation, what was that? He said, it was bringing in the agent, bringing in Phil Cassie, and Phil Cassie went to A1 Heyman and worked out a deal for a tour that we were supposed to go on with him and Miss Mary J. Blige. Okay, question. When you say him, who are you referring to? He said, Mr. Kelly. She said, did that Live Nation tour in fact take place? He said, no, it never took place. She said, what happened? He said, I think at that moment, Mr. Kelly started playing second tier markets and never did the... Mr. Caddick said, I'm going to object to the response. The judge said, did you set up the dates? The witness says, Mr. Stevens says, I set up with the agent Phil Cassie. I brought him in to set up the dates. The judge says, do you know what happened? Whether they went on tour? And the witness said, no, there was no tour. The judge said, there was no tour. All right. Next question. Ms. Shihata says, was any money paid for the tour? He said, yes. My understanding, the first half of the money was paid. And then she said, to whom? Mr. Kelly. He said, Mr. Kelly. She said, were you involved at all in setting up any other tours or working on any other tours with the defendant? He said, I think the very first one might have been the Black Panties tour. And she said, what, if anything, did you do with respect to that? He said, that was just kind of negotiating with the gentleman by the name of Blackie and dealing with the promoters. The judge says, keep your voice up. He says, I'm sorry. And she says, Ms. Shihata says, who was Blackie? He answered, at the time, he was the partner. He was partner and also active CPA, I think, at the time. I think he was handling the business accountant, the business manager at the time. Ms. Shihata says, who did you understand Blackie to work for? He said, Mr. Kelly. She said, with respect to the deal with RCA that you mentioned, did you work with anyone else that worked with the defendant on that? He said, yes, Miss Linda Mensch and Red Light Coran Capshaw, I think. Miss Shihata says, you mentioned Linda Mensch. Who was she? He said, at the time, I think she was the active attorney. And Miss Shihata said, for who? He said, Mr. Kelly. She said, you mentioned Red Light. What is that? And he says, Coran Capshaw was the management for Red Light. She says, is that a management company? He said, yes. She said, did they work with the defendant? He said, yes. She said, I'm showing you what is marked for identification as Government's Exhibit 44. Do you recognize this? Yes. Who is this? Ms. Lynch. And the Michigan says, move to admit Government's Exhibit 44. Mr. Koenig said, no objection. The judge said, that's an evidence. Ms. Shihata said, may we publish it? The judge said, sure. Then Ms. Shihata continues to ask, at some point while you were working with the defendant, did Cheryl Mack's role change? He said, yes. She became Mr. Kelly's assistant. And Ms. Shihata said, did she no longer work as your assistant? He said, no, correct. She said, was she off of your payroll? He said, yes. Ms. Shihata said, you testified earlier that the defendant used your residence at certain points. Is that right? She said, yes, correct. He said, yes, correct. She said, in what ways did he use your residence? He said, to actually train playing basketball and recording. She asked, was that in one of the recording studios in your residence? He said, yes. She said, did you ever attend any of the basketball playing that the defendant did at your residence? He said, yes. She said, did you play in any games? He said, I played a few games. I got a few rebounds, kicked the ball out. She said, can you explain in the games that you attended or played in what the setup was? He said, it was kind of us training, playing ball, always people around, a few people in the gym while we were playing. She said, what, if anything, unusual did you notice about people in the gym? He said, I think it was always kind of like people around, but Mr. Kelly would always have women watch him play. She said, where would they sit? He said they would actually sit in a corner, like kind of away from everybody, kind of isolated in the corner. She said, what, if any, did you notice about that? He said, I mean, you know, if the ball kind of rolled over by them, and you had to get the ball, they would actually like kind of like cross their legs and look at the ceiling or look at the wall. That, and then she says, that was when someone was approaching to get the ball. He said, approaching to get the ball. Ms. Shihata said, I'm showing what you is in evidence as government's exhibit 4. Do you recognize this person? He said, yes. She said, who do you recognize that to be? He said, Junebug, the security / personal assistant. She said, to whom? He said, Mr. Kelly. She said, showing you in evidence government's exhibit 18. Do you recognize this? He said, yes. She said, who is this? He said, security, Hammer. She said, he went by the name Hammer? He said, goes by the name Hammer. She said, security for whom? He said, Mr. Kelly. She said, did there come a time when your business relationship with the defendant deteriorated? He said, say it again. She said, did there come a time when your business relationship with the defendant ended? He said, yes. She said, why did it end? He said it ended because after negotiations of his last recording agreement with RCA, I sent in, after working on the deal with Red Light and Linda Mensch, I sent in my invoice first, and then the invoice got rejected in terms of what the compensation was supposed to be. Ms. Shihata said, so were you paid at all? He said, no, I was never paid. She said, after you sent in the invoice and were not paid, what, if anything, did you do? He said, actually, at that point, I called my attorney. And then my attorney reached out to Linda Mensch, and the response came back. Mr. Kelly said he doesn't owe you anything. Ms. Shihata says, prior to that, had you attempted to reach the defendant yourself? He said, correct. She said, and what methods did you use to do that? He said, text message. She said, sitting here today, do you recall what number you texted the defendant at? He said, yes, I can recall what number. She said, do you remember the exact number? He said, no, I don't remember the exact number. She said, I'm showing the witness only what is marked for identification as government exhibit 255A. Do you recognize this? He said, yes. She said, what is this? He said, that looks like a screenshot from my cell phone, Mr. Kelly's number. She said, I moved to admit government's exhibit 255A. Mr. Caddick said no objection. The judge said, oh, sorry. I hate when that happens. Okay, babe. Okay. Mr. Canning says no objection. The judge says that's an evidence you can publish. Ms. Shihata said thank you. Then she continues to question and say, at the top it says R3K. Who is that referring to? He said, Mr. Kelly. And what is the number you had saved your phone from? He said 312-972-7283. She asked, is that the correct number you text? He said, correct. She said, I'm showing the witness only what is marked for identification as Government's Exhibit 255B. I'm showing you the first page first and then the second page. Do you recognize this exhibit? He said, yes, I do. She said, generally speaking, what is this exhibit? He said, say it again. She said, generally speaking, what is this exhibit? He said, a conversation that I was having with Mr. Kelly. She said, is it a text message conversation? He says, text message, yes. She said, and is this screenshots from your phone? He said, yes. And she says, move to admit Government's Exhibit 255B. Mr. Caddick said no objection. The judge says that's an evidence you can publish. Ms. Shihata said thank you. Then she asked him, starting with the first page of this exhibit, the text in white with the black background and white. Who is that from? He said, that's from Mr. Kelly. She said, and are your responses in blue? He said, yes, correct. She said, looking at the text message that the defendant sent you, what date is this from? He said, November 25th, 2015. She said, what were you working on around that time? I gotta get a refill on water, guys. Give me a second. Now, Ms. Shihata says, what were you working on around that time? He said, at that time, that was the renegotiation of his agreement. She said, with whom? He said, with RCA. She said, and was that something you were working on? He said, yes. She said, and looking at this text message that he sent to you, what was this about? He said, what I can recall, I think it's about the team, the whole team working together, because I think at this point I was working on more music, just trying to formulate the team really is what that conversation was about. She said, when the defendant texts you, I just called her and she didn't pick up, but I text her. Who did you understand the her and she to be in that sentence? He said, Linda Mensch. She said, on the bottom of the first page, did you write a response saying, agree, let's go fourth quarter down by 10? He said, correct. She said, what did you mean by that? He said, let's get it going. Just trying to motivate him to let's close out and keep moving forward. Go down by 10. She said, close out what? He said, any deals or bring the team together, whatever we needed to do to keep moving. She said, I'm going to show you in a moment page 2 of Government Exhibit 255B. I asked that this before the jury only be. At the top of this is the top just a continuation of the text from the defendant that we were looking at on the first page, plus your response that we just went over? He said yes. She said, and then the series of text messages underneath that, are those all text messages from you to the defendant? He said, correct. She said, and the first one, is that dated November 25th, 2014? He said, yes. She said, and you wrote, King, you're still there? Yo. He said, yes. She said, and why did you send that? He said, I think at the time he stated that he was going back to Chicago and he'll be back. I was just wondering, was he still in Atlanta? She said, then the next text message here is from March 21st, 2015. Is that right? He said, correct. What did you write there? He said, King, you good? Because I wasn't getting any response. She said, had you had any communications with the defendant between November 25th, 2014 and March 21st, 2015? He said, no. She said, when you said King, who are you referring to? He said, Mr. Kelly. She said, the next text message is that from you to him to the defendant on July 23rd, 2015. He said, yes. She said, and what did you write there? He said, you ready? Here I come. She said, why did you write that? He said, just letting him know. I think at that point I received a letter back from, I sent a letter back from Linda Mensch stating that the work that I did, that I wouldn't be compensated. She said, did you send another message on August 21st, 2015? He said, correct. She said, does it say, without saying the name, does it say a certain name there? He said, yes. She said, and what is depicted after that name? He said, a rat emoji. She said, you sent that to the defendant? He said, yes. She said, you mentioned that you ended up, you mentioned that you ended up, you at some point retained a lawyer in connection with your dispute with the defendant. He said, yes. She said, did you ever end up filing a lawsuit against him? He said, no, I never filed a lawsuit. She said, why not? Mr. Koenig said, objection. The judge said, sustained. Then Shihata says, I'm showing you what is marked for identification as Government's Exhibit 75. The judge says, Ms. Shihata, I'm going to stop you. Is this a good time for your morning break? Ms. Shihata said, sure. The judge says, ladies and gentlemen, we'll break for about 10 minutes. Please don't talk about the case. We'll see you in a few minutes. The courtroom deputy tells everyone to rise, and then the jury exits the courtroom. Now the judge says the witness can step down. And the judge says, do you know how much longer you have? And then Ms. Shihata said, a few minutes. The judge said, and then, is this your witness, Mr. Kanik? Mr. Kanik said, yes. The judge said, do you think we'll fit in another witness this morning? Mr. Kanik said, I'm pretty confident we'll at least be able to start another witness. The judge says, we'll be in recess then. Now the judge says, you may be seated. The deputy says, the witness is reminded he's still under oath. The judge says, go ahead. Now he's still being examined by Ms. Shihata. And she asked, I'm showing you what is in evidence as Government's Exhibit 75. Without saying this person's name, do you recognize this person? Yes. And do you knowing this person's full name without saying? He said yes. She said, I'm showing the witness only what is marked for identification as Government's Exhibit 75A. Is this the same photo I just showed you? He said, correct. She said, and does this have and does this have this individual's full name underneath? He said, yes. She said, and is this the name you know this individual by? He said, yes. Ms. Shihata said, I move to admit Government's Exhibit 75A and would ask to publish it to the jury only. The judge says, any objection? Mr. Kanik said, I thought it was in evidence. The judge said, I thought so too. Ms. Shihata said, it's slightly different. May we publish to the jury only? The judge says, yes, go ahead. Ms. Shihata says, for purposes of your testimony here today, we're going to refer to the person in Government Exhibit 75 and 75A as Jane, okay? He said, okay. Turning off my fan, it's kind of cold in here now. Okay, sorry. Then she asks, for purposes of your testimony here today, we're going to refer to the person in Government's Exhibit 75 and 75A as Jane, okay? He said, okay. She said, have you ever met Jane? He said, yes. She said, around when did you meet her? He said, 2020. She said, what were the circumstances under which you met her? He said, Jane contacted me through social media. Mr. Kanik says, I want to object to the relevance beyond the scope of the charges here. And the judge said, you can just say objection. Objection is overruled. You can go ahead. Then he answers, she contacted me through social media to ask me. Mr. Kanik said, objection. The judge said, the conversation is, I'll sustain it. Then Ms. Shihata says, for what purpose were you meeting with Jane? He said, to help her with her career. She said, music career? He said, music career. The judge said, when? Ms. Shihata said 2020, and then the witness says 2020. Ms. Shihata said, what, if anything, did you learn from Jane regarding the text with her name and the rat emoji that you had sent to the defendant? Mr. Kanik said, objection. The judge said, can I see the parties on the side with the court reporter? So they had a sidebar conference held to the side. The judge said, I read the materials on this. I read the materials on this. And here is what I think. You're going to lead through this. You want to bring out the fact that he wasn't trying to say that she was a rat, correct? And to send a different kind of message to Kelly. The problem is the message that he wants to send the defendant is, I know you're messing around with younger. Mishihata said, because of, I was avoiding asking that question because of the hearsay objection. What I'm trying to get is a prior consistent statement that Jane had made to the defendant about what happened, to this witness about what happened after the defendant received the text. The judge says, I think it's relevant because there was testimony from her. I don't remember if there was cross-examination. I think there was about this message with the rat. I think it's relevant to show that he was not trying to get her in trouble, which I think is the purpose for bringing it out. Is that right? Mishihata said, Your Honor, Jane testified when she was on the stand that after an incident that occurred after the defendant received this text from Devin Stevens, sorry about that, where he then hit her, including with a shoe. So I think if he's permitted to respond to this question, he will indicate that she told him that that happened. All right, guys, I'm going to leave it here for our brother Atmos Love. He can read it from 1774. This is where I'm going to end it at. All right, guys. Oh, I forgot to stop sharing my screen. Sorry, guys. So that's where I'm going to end it at. We are at page 1794. Yeah, so we're at 1794. Guys, please do me a favor. Don't forget, on your way out, please hit that like button. Share. Keep continuing to share. And my email is on the bottom of the screen here, so you can email me anything you need to, suggestions, tips. You have a comment. Also, if you would like transcripts and you donate to the fund, you are entitled to a transcript. My information is also on the bottom of the screen here. You can Zelle me, you can Cash App me, you can also PayPal me. Okay? And when you do, please remember to put your name in the subject part. Say, I'm Fat Boy on YouTube and I donated to Atmos, and let me know, and then I'll cross-examine with Atmos, double check, make sure you did, and I will send the transcripts to you guys. If you donated to me, I'll know who you are, but please just make sure you put your YouTube name so I know who you are. Okay? All right, guys, thank you so much. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. And Diva Divine Light is out. Peace.